Welcome to the Wolfe Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolfe Power Club podcast, the biggest energy podcast on the Apple charts. And we are delighted that in International Energy Week, we have got another member of the energy community that sits on boards, that makes decisions, that's involved in the energy transition. Please can we welcome Monica Collings to the podcast.
Alex, it's great to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Monica, I've been looking at your CV in LinkedIn. Impressive is an understatement. And I think I'd like to kick off with, you've had multiple board positions in the energy sector, whether it's non-executive director. I see you've recently joined the leadership team at Adler Allan, but also you chair Plug and Go. What do you think makes great leadership in energy transition?
I mean, it's a great question to kick off with, and not a small one for us to tackle. I suppose we, as a sector, have been undergoing what I would call a sort of VUCA environment, where we've been dealing with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity for a number of years, and that continues. There's a great deal of adversity at the same time as trying to fundamentally change a sector that has been built on a great deal of legacy and historically sort of engineering principles. So when we're looking as leaders to create a platform of hope and positivity, we have to role model the fact that actually we're now putting customers front and center at the heart of this future energy system, that we need to see active participation, and leaders are evolving their organizations to think more about consumer first. But that visibility that comes with being a leader through times of adversity, I think, is really important. So it's something that has always been fundamental as part of my approach in all of my leadership roles.
Now, it's International Energy Week. You're a keynote speaker on tripling smart and resilient clean energy systems. I'm intrigued. Obviously, the people in the auditorium will hear your views on it, but I'm intrigued how you're going to do it, because I find with energy, it's either boom or bust. And what I mean by that is that either stuff takes very long to be adapted and there's 1,000,001 problems, or stuff is in so much demand. You've then got the enjoyable position of how do we actually get the supply chain out. I remember when AdBlue first came out for Euro 5 and Euro 6 engines, it was a great opportunity, but suddenly we had to massively change all of our retail states and so on. And then I've had other technology where you're on a period for 3 or 4 years talking at every conference, trying to convince every business leader, trying to convince every stakeholder, and it feels like it never gets the momentum even though the science is there. So how do we triple smart?
Another really small question to solve. I mean, we are, in a nutshell, looking at trying to decarbonize by 2030 the energy system, but we're also looking at this sort of longer term horizon for 2050 of delivering net zero. And there's only really one sort of set of principles that I think that we can hold on to, and that's how we prioritize renewables, reward flexibility, and optimize demand in the right way. So we've got to align ourselves behind a single direction. I mean, we've had all sorts of challenges around understanding the path in which we're going to take to get to that final end point. And that's had all sorts of knock-on implications for investment and attracting the right levels of investment in the sector. But we've got to build and connect renewables. We've got to replace the gas-fired generation that exists today. We've got to think about electrification of more of the demand side of things. So smarter, more flexible energy systems have to be enabled by smart meters. Those have got to be rolled out. We've got to continue that program and see that delivered effectively. And over time, we're going to change the shape of demand. And what I think consumers voted Labour in with was a promise that bills will come down. But the reality is that's going to take time, and that's not going to happen overnight. We're going to need to see this evolving, rapidly transforming landscape, which will be enabled by expanding our infrastructure, focusing on heat electrification and transport. But it comes from a place of having a really bold ambition, right? And having strong emphasis on low carbon technologies, policy, regulatory change, addressing the skills gap, attracting that level of investment that's needed to sustain all of that. There is so much change that's needed, right?
And I think that's where it's exciting as well. And one of the
Mm.
things we try and push on the podcast is there couldn't be a better time to have a career in energy. And I sometimes felt frustrated when I was previously at a company where graduates could do a number of they'd have 2 years and they'd have a number of placements on that 2 years across different business sectors. One was energy, one was medical, one was IT, and I always got the feedback, we love energy but we're not sure it's going to be about. And I'm like, trust me, people are always going to have hot showers, want a warm house, and want to travel somewhere to see friends and relatives or see new destinations.
Mm.
Therefore, you will always you might have to have a cleaner energy sector, but you'll always have an energy sector, and therefore the skill sets will be huge time. And I think it's a huge area of optimism. But any part of optimism is always challenged by funding. We have had various people in the past in this podcast, from founders to venture capitalists to pension funds to people who advise the state on where the Treasury should be putting funds. What would you say the biggest bottleneck across the various things that you've been involved in that is a bottleneck for raising funds when it comes for great energy solutions to happen?
Okay, so I mean, there's one thing that investors hate above all else, and that's uncertainty, right? And we've seen uncertainty in abundance, and unfortunately, bottlenecks set the pace and depth of change. And so, unless we can create certainty, we're not going to resolve that, right? So there's the geopolitical landscape, and that has been challenging both here in the UK, but also in the US, where we've seen great volatility. And those decisions that are made now will be setting out for the rest of the decade and into the next, the direction of travel and the pace of that change. I think what we are looking for as a whole is a fair and competitive, secure and sustainable energy market. Right, that's what we're trying to get to. But what we haven't seen at a global level is consensus around what we're going to get there. And when we're thinking about investment, we're not just competing for investment here in the UK. We're thinking at a global level. How do we make sure that we get the necessary funding? With all that uncertainty around, grid connections or market reform or supply chain constraints or skills gaps, like all of these big meaty challenges add to an already complex picture, but create more and more uncertainty. So I think it's been great that the government's been very quick off the blocks in setting that direction of travel, but there are still so many unanswered questions, and that means that it's going to be fragmented and messy for a little while longer, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think what we've seen is that so many of the new technologies, if there was a very transparent global market on taxation of things like carbon penalties or the free scope penalties, then a lot of tech would happen much quicker, I feel, because at the moment, lots of fascinating technology will vastly reduce carbon, but the initial startup costs are massive. And if there's no investor opportunity that's within their own careers, it's always going to put people off. And that's what I do worry about. And I do hope out of International Energy Week, with the great minds that are coming to London, we break some of those barriers in the next 4 days. Interestingly, though, you've joined an organisation that has many hats, and you very recently joined Adler Allan. It's an organisation I know well. For our listeners that don't know Adler Allan, I'm sure you can comment a bit more, Monica, but they do everything from building infrastructure, servicing equipment, and I first came across 2 decades ago when we supported them in they won the fuel distribution bid for the Olympics in 2012, and we supported them with backup services and drivers and facilities, and also they have done many builds for me, tank cleanings, inspections, filter changes, but I know that they've got a vast estate of interest these days. So, um, what would you say that with Adler Allan joining as a non-executive are the sort of big wins potentially for Adler Allan, and what can they potentially do for some of our listeners who are thinking, I haven't engaged Adler Allan before, where could they use them?
Yeah, really interesting business. I'm delighted to join the board. So, Goldman Sachs acquired the kind of majority stake in the business towards the back end of last year, and brought me in as part of the new board there. And I mean, you've talked about infrastructure and what and some of the services that they offer in that space, but they also do a hell of a lot more around monitoring, data analytics. There's the frontline operational asset maintenance part, but there's also environmental consultancy part. So the growth ambition that the business has is very much around deepening presence across UK and our operations here, but in Europe and North America. In fact, our chair is in America himself, and so there is definitely a very big growth ambition there. We also have been thinking about M&A. I mean, the business is quite acquisitive in its nature, and so there's been plenty of businesses that have become part of the group, but more opportunity there for sure. Talking about the sort of next 12 months, and one of the things that I really loved about the business when I started talking to them is that they really put ESG into action every day. It's really tangible and you can see it. Lots of organisations talk about it, but this sort of end-to-end approach is really practical, and it's trying to help customers on that transition by recognising that they have different needs at different points, and to try and have a more critical role in making the transition happen by adding value into existing business practices, but at the same time protecting the environment. And that's so important in what we're doing. And when you're talking about tank services, for example, that there are still going to need to be those kinds of services even as we go through the transition. So for energy specifically, I think Adler Allan is very involved in the transition, particularly with high voltage grid connections, really essential, supporting to shift that renewable energy direction by having a role in enabling and increasing those LTTs. With water, which is increasingly interesting because we've got the AMP8 investment cycle, and how we help clients to modernise critical systems. Flood reductions and preventing sewer overflows and things like that. So with an environmental focus, we've got growing complexities around things like pollutants, so all the things that are associated with infrastructures, pollutants like PFAS. I mean, fascinating around some of the challenges that we have in understanding how that is really going to affect environmental risks. So I just think so much opportunity and really, really exciting business.
No, I genuinely think it is, and I know we've got quite a few Adler Allan listeners because they always quote on LinkedIn and say so. I think it's exciting times ahead for the group and the company, and I really what I've always liked about Adler Allan, it always feels like there is a sort of engineering passion at the start of every project, and then that's what sort of leads to the solutions or the possibles, but. You're also chair of a company that I think is quite different in some ways in terms of plug and go, and not so much plug and go themselves, but as a sector, the whole point of charge points, and I appreciate it's different in geographical areas, but has had a lot of criticism from consumers in terms of we've seen quite a few trends now, whether it's UK or whether it's in the Nordics, where essentially there's been tax advantage that have got the first movers onto electric vehicles and charge cycles. Then essentially the popularity has happened. Then you get the sort of famous Instagram photos of long queues or people moaning on
Mm,
Twitter about charge points being down, and then you see people actually of their future vehicle sort of going to hybrid instead of straight electric to kind of balance their odds. And I was just wondering, as someone that has an interest in a charge operator, how do you think charge operators will get public confidence back? Because it seems at the moment it gets more traffic than anything else when we raise questions. Because I think actually those who've gone to a form of electric vehicle are pretty happy with it, but actually it's the charge operation which has sometimes challenged them to go back to hybrid.
yeah, I think we're going back to the same part where we started our conversation around consumer, right? Because if we can walk in the shoes of consumers and understand what's really going on with them, then we can develop solutions that meet their needs brilliantly. I moved to an EV over 4 years ago, and my biggest frustrations and concerns were around the infrastructure and range anxiety, as with most. And even now, as a seasoned EV driver, I would say there's still things that influence my decisions around the type of vehicle I purchase and how I use it. And so I think, what we've done at Plug and Go, which is quite interesting, is actually look at how we can partner with organisations like the AA that are really fantastic in breakdown and recovery and understanding customers in distress as that sort of fourth emergency service, and helping to develop solutions where if a customer finds themselves stuck at a charge point and needs to get recovered, then we have found a way of being able to recover them and help them, and that becomes a service that we offer. So almost that aftercare and that really understanding what is motivating customers in that moment. But the automotive industry has been doing this for years and done it really, really well in many places. And I think that, again, let's not think about EV charging infrastructure as an engineering solution. Let's think about it as a way of enabling customers to move from point A to B, and helping them to do so in a way that is comfortable and easy. It's not hard,
And just
Alex. It's not hard.
getting back to International Energy Week, we have the world leaders coming. You've obviously got interest within the energy sector, and as you said, coming from that sort of working with the likes of Goldman Sachs, they will have a lot of interest of various different parties. What would you like to get out of International Energy Week outside of an awesome session? What essentially would you like to sort of achieve from the week ahead?
Yeah. So I mean, I've been going to International Energy Week now for a few years, and I think the conversations have evolved for me from, talking about actually hypothetical potential opportunities to actually really getting into execution now and delivery focused. The conversation is always really honest about progress. I think we talk a lot about innovation, exploring tech advancements, sharing best practice and ideas. Having that international perspective is quite valuable because we can see where we are against the rest of the world, really considering how barriers are being faced and what we can do to overcome. I mean, I still feel like we can talk about customers more. I'm never going to stop banging on about it because I think, we just talk about engineering solutions so much and it's great, but we have, we need, there's a whole shortage of green skills that are needed. I think something like 300,000 roles that will be created. And obviously, I very passionately talk about diversity, having been the only female chief executive running a retailer, and my own lived experiences of being one of very few female leaders in the sector. But I do genuinely believe, as you sort of referenced, this is a really exciting place to have a career if you're going to find somewhere to sort of build an exciting and really fruitful, place to grow and develop. So, and that's something that I think I certainly last year saw a lot more conversation about, and I think it's something that isn't going to go away, particularly with the rise of AI.
I think you're spot on with a couple of points there. I think the first is that I find it quite interesting. I was previously on the gender committee at a multinational within the sector, and when we looked at our stats compared to the finance sector, we were quite far behind. So actually, what I have seen is that with sort of more and more energy companies getting closer to experts from finance coming in, there's been actually a greater sort of breakthrough. And I'm glad to say at Wolfe Power Club, of our 6 specials for International Energy Week, 5 out of the 6 are female. That's just the way it fell. Not any particular objective or anything like that, but just there's a lot of very good speakers, and we've gone for the best speakers.
Mm.
The other thing that I think you're right in terms of the consumer side of things is that I always loved what Rory Sullivan once said in a TEDx talk, when he was like, "Look, you give the Eurotunnel as a challenge, to a engineer, and he will possibly, at the cost of a few billion, save another 10 minutes off the travel time. It's like you give the marketeer an opportunity at something like the Channel Tunnel, and it could well be even an hour slower, but have the best restaurants, the best performances, great areas to take the kids, and
Yeah.
actually the holiday comes the area and not so much the tech." And I always feel like, as soon as I see like a diagram with the atomic structure, the periodic table, I'm like, yeah, we're kind of missing it. And I always feel that Tesla did nail it, that when they brought their cars first out, it wasn't how green they are, it's just we're quicker than a Lamborghini or Ferrari in a straight line. And I think Elon really kind of nailed, like, kind of sometimes what makes buying decisions tick. And I think it's a great message for our International Energy Week leaders. Now, coming back more into an area that I'm familiar with, as most of my listeners know, that outside the podcast, I'm a director at one of the leading AI and data companies blend in the energy sector. What role do you feel that AI and data, because you're across a number of different companies, could have in the next few years? And do you see it actually enabling sort of breakthroughs with energy transition?
Well, given that you know more about this than I do, that's a really unfair question, but I'll try and answer it from what I've seen and my own experiences. But look, I think data as an asset is going to be really important. And if we look at AI and the potential that it has, an industry scale to really drive parts of this transition, I think it's going to be really fundamental and really important. And it becomes how we do that, how we move from lots of pilots in lots of different places to operationalizing the potential for AI. Right, we've got so much to do from a consumer perspective. If tech can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us, how do we do it so that it makes things easier? How can we, offset some of the investment decisions by, for example, relying more on flexibility as a solution, because that has the potential to enable us to not only do things like improve billing accuracy or efficiency in our operations, but also, proactively to help us solve some of the challenges around debt propensity, for example. And we've seen what 4 billion owed to energy companies in debt that's been accumulated over the energy crisis. And those are heavy burdens if we're expecting customers to just take on manually trying to cope with all of this change and move from being consumers to prosumers to a world where we're going to introduce things like virtual power plants and expect them to be participants in it without having AI enabled solutions. So, I mean, it's a little bit cliched, but I just keep coming back to the fact that we have to approach this as if we're walking in a customer's shoes and understanding not only what they need now, but what they need in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen the trends. I think from a director level, vision over their business, so that actually they get a set of reporting that answers their questions, and sometimes that's a lot harder than you think, especially some of the stuff that I've been involved
Mm.
in up in the sort of North Sea. And then the other thing is sort of maintenance, health and safety. I've always seen as an industry, we always want to get better. I think anyone that ends up in energy, health and safety is so high up, but just human nature is difficult to tackle, and maintenance of equipment is a challenge, as Adler Allan do so much on it. And then the final bit on the consumer side is almost, I see in the financial side, they've had the best success in terms of I think most people now enjoy the results of open banking, the fact that you can do so much from your phone, you can have multiple accounts, and that's the kind of exciting stuff for me about when you get data right, like sort of, bringing stuff together. So just before we go into our quick fire questions, Monica, what's the best way for our listeners to possibly engage with businesses you're involved in, and staying in touch with you before we go into our quick fire questions?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I am quite active. I talk about leadership and diversity, and I talk about my work. I'm also on Instagram under the handle Circles in a Circle, which you can find out all about there. But it's my life as a Ned and the behind the scenes. So it's all the real stuff and top tips around if you're thinking about becoming a Ned at any point in the future, what it's really like and how you can make that transition from executive to non-executive. So you can find me in those two places. That's where I mostly hang out.
Right, our quick fire questions that we ask all of our listeners. So the first one: who is the most relevant person in your contacts book that should be on the next Wolfe Power Club podcast?
So, I mean, I could answer this with so many different people who are amazing, but I'm going to speak to someone who nobody will have heard of, but I think she's going to be super famous and amazing. So, it's a tech innovator, and her name is Lisa Malone. And she is super passionate. She is on a mission to make every household in the UK breathe better, in terms of quality of air, removing barriers to better buildings, heat, support, all of that kind of stuff. She is a joy. She's an absolute joy, and she's a powerhouse. She's doing some fantastic work, particularly lobbying government around some of their policies. So she's one to watch.
Oh, brilliant. I think I might get her to inspect a certain house in Greater London and try and make it better. I gotta say, one of our best speakers we ever had was Jan Rosenau, who is passionate about how much heat we lose through the housing estate
Yeah.
of Britain, and passionate about not just heat pump solutions, but saying that if we got that in order, it would open up so much grid capacity, take away so many effects on the environment. So anyone who is putting energy into the tech and changing behaviour on that, we would definitely love to have on. The next quick fire question is that over the next year or so, where will you be investing in the energy industry, whether it's with time, financial, or thought leadership?
Um, I mean, I'm going to continue to champion the cause of women in the sector because I think we just have to keep banging that drum until we get gender equality. We just need to do that. Flexibility. I think that's going to be a really big theme, and I think it's going to accelerate at pace. I just think that we are going to see so much change in that space that it's going to be a big focus for a conversation, and also attracting lots of investment. So those would be the two big ones. I think, as I've already said, EV infrastructure and renewables, safe bet, but there's going to be plenty of activity going on there and needing investment.
No, definitely, definitely. I think that's a really, really a good shout. And as someone with two daughters, I will be fully supporting this glass ceiling being smashed and creating our future leaders and CEOs of whatever gender. But they are getting us clean energy, and it'll be fantastic. I think the next quick fire question is specifically the next 12 months. What would you like the British government to be doing in the next 12 months?
Let's get Rima sorted out. Just figure
It's
it out, shall we? About time.
what is there a certain area of Rima right now that you would like to sort of escalate or just get more efficient or
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, we've come back to the point around uncertainty and clarity over the direction of travel. We've got a lot to do over the course of the next 5 years. We've got to change governance structures, rules. We've got to be clear about customers and their role and how we're going to support them by trying to drive bills down. Companies are sat waiting to make decisions because they don't know about things like zonal pricing, which is going to affect all sorts of things around generation and capacity in the future. So that it just feels like that's a really big, meaty topic that if we can get it right, at least give the clarity over it. I mean, it's going to take years to implement, but if we start now, then we might stand a chance of being able to implement something that sets us up for the future.
Yeah, no, and I think the possible is definitely on, because you know in this podcast we've gone around the world and you see some of the cool stuff that's happening in like Texas or Finland, and you're like, we could have a bit of that here. Do you know what I mean? We're not that far behind, and I feel that we could really do it. The final question, in before you're back into the rooms of International Energy Week, is that what would you like the customers to do? Because I always find that it's quite easy to have a go at industry or government or where the money's going, but we also sometimes need customer behaviour to change, or the public behaviour change. I always actually feel quite sorry, like for the likes of the NHS, that actually if just us Brits were healthier, it might actually sort out a lot of the other challenges. But on an energy specific one, where would you like the customer to go in the sort of next 12 months?
I mean, the biggest thing that I think at this point is don't lose faith in net zero, because there's so much apathy towards, sustainability messages, greenwashing, all of that backlash against the good work that's been done and that we're trying to do, because the affordability challenges have become so profound that we're seeing a lot of skepticism. And we can have a clean and affordable energy system that sets us up for the future. We can deliver that and we can do it all. But if customers start losing faith, I mean, we saw it in the energy crisis where retailers were, they were hailed as the enemy. They were hated. I think there were brand surveys that suggested they were as hated as tobacco and gambling firms. It was a really horrible place to be, and you just didn't want to operate in that space. But what we're now seeing is a lot of backlash against green initiatives, and what we don't want is a two-tier energy system where we've got those that can afford and those that can't, and we don't want to reward those with LCTs that actually probably aren't the most vulnerable in society, and those that are left behind because they have all these affordability challenges and are buried in debt. So that wasn't a very quick answer, but I just don't lose faith. Don't lose faith. Hold on. We're doing our best.
Well, I've always been a big fan of George Michael and Wham, so you've got to have faith is always important.
There you go.
You have to listen to a back episode where we have the world's greenest rabbi. So if you guys listen to that's a great one, of where he talks about spirituality and the ethics behind energy transition. But I would like to just thank you for your time, Monica. I think listeners, you today have heard that there are big challenges out there for the energy provider. We heard about the 4 billion in unpaid bills. We heard about the energy transition needs certainty, and whether it's charge point operators or whether it's the likes of Adler Allan, on certainty they can grow into many territories with many solutions. And then I think Monica raised the very, very clear point that actually to get good leadership, it needs to have flexibility and parameters. That means the best people get in there. So we are delighted to have had Monica, and I can see why people want you on the board. Emotionally very, very clear and understanding what the public need and the consumer needs, but also just very to the point, and have been a great speaker on the podcast today. Thank you for your time, Monica.
Alex, thanks for having me.